Okay, welcome back to Unit 8. We are about halfway through Unit 8, and last lectures were on photography. And so the design elements that we're going to be talking about for Unit 8 are two things. One, we're going to be kind of continuing with our discussion about composition in general and talking about visual pathways. And then related to that, we're going to be talking a little bit more specifically about focus and then how that relates to emphasis and to dominance and to the whole issue of hierarchy and emphasis. So kind of wrapping all of this stuff that we've been talking about in terms of design and composition together. So, but the first thing I want to start talk about is visual pathways. So I want you to start with thinking about paintings in a very kind of literal way. Here we have a Claude Lorraine painting. So this is a Baroque era painting. Lorraine was about the same time period, a little bit older than Poussin, and was much admired for his landscape paintings. And these are landscape paintings, but they are landscapes with narrative, with story in them. And I want you to look at this for a second, and I want you to think about how this painting is designed in a particular way to kind of tell a story. And the story is not just the story of what the characters are doing in the painting, it's the story of us exploring the space. And then as we explore the space, we're also kind of exploring the narrative of what the characters are doing. But more than that, we are here, we're entering this space, but we don't stay here. Our eyes move through this space. And so you might notice that the logical place to cross this little river right here is right about there. And you might climb these hills and look at these trees. And your eye is doing this almost unconsciously. And then, of course, you see, oh, look, that path leads right to that bridge. And that bridge takes you right across that river. And it takes you to this little hill city over here. And that's group. And that takes you to that shore. And look, there's ships, little boats on that lake. And you can cross this lake. You can go all the way over to that mountain, right? So as we're looking at a painting like this, our eye explores it as if we were physically wandering this landscape space and we are, wandering through it. And it's designed like it's to work that way, where all these elements, like being able to see that little bit of a pathway, being able to see the bridge, being able to see the pathway going into the city, these are conscious decisions to help give us reasons for our eye to move through the space. And what I want you to think about is how this is a very kind of literal way of thinking about how the eye might move through a picture. But once you start thinking of it this way, you can then start thinking of it in a more complex way. So here's another way to think about it, which is we could start with these figures and then climb up here. And then we could start to explore things where we wouldn't be able to walk it, right? Our eye could move up this column and into this tree. And from that point right there, as our eye visually goes around to that tree, we could drop right down to that city that's miles and miles away from us. So that's not a literal kind of walking through the space, but it's still a path that our eye can take. These are both kind of visual pathways, but one's a literal visual pathway that follows the way you would literally walk through the landscape space, and another one is just a more following the shapes and how they lead to each other. And want you to think about those two things kind of in contrast to each other. So here's the painting back in its normal scale for a second. So now, if you think about this painting, and actually a couple of different similar paintings by Watteau, we can think of them in a much more how they're constructed as being, it's not just about those geometric issues of composition that we talked about. Remember when I was talking about Watteau before, I talked about how he was consciously using kind of corner diagonals in the center and those kind of geometric decisions, but he was playing off of them and trying very much to keep the composition to feel open and loose and not strictly tied to that geometry. But another way of thinking about this composition is how our eye moves through the composition. How does our eye decide to where we feel like we enter the composition? What are the major areas of focus, right? And then where do we move from there? This grouping here, and what that leads our eye to next, right? And then there'll be alternate pathways. We can go from this group of figures up to there and then down to this, as well as going this way, right? So it's kind of some similar issues, both kind of literal pathways that our eye can follow, as well as other more kind of visual pathways. And now we can look at these paintings that we had seen before and see how that also plays a part. As much as this composition is about this diagonal and that diagonal, and about this, the diagonal goes straight through St. Francis's heart, right? And it's kind of like represents the connection with the divine. And like I pointed out, these arcs that fit into that corner kind of neatly. It's also about a pathway, right, that leads us. Now notice, he does not give us a clear path from this edge of this cliff to the space back there, but a visual pathway that takes us kind of on a journey from, either from his, his place in the wilderness to the place he's left, or vice versa, back to him. And the same is true about the Giorgione painting, which is there's this sense of kind of a narrative pathway moving through it, leading us further and further back into the painting. In a way, almost all landscape does this to a degree. It's almost impossible to make a landscape painting that doesn't, to a certain degree, become a journey painting, a painting about our eyes' movement through the space, and that movement being, in a way, a metaphor for the movement of the figures in the space. Now here's a painting where the journey is a little bit more maybe confusing or complex. We don't have any clear sense of how we're going to enter. We almost feel like we're blocked here. We can kind of see that there might be a pathway right there. There's a sense that maybe you could traipse through these fields, but we feel kind of blocked a little bit. But nonetheless, if we pause for a second, we can see certain places. We might feel like we enter the painting here, or we might feel like we enter the painting here. I think they're both kind of equally. We definitely feel like our eye is going to stop right there. It's such an unusual moment in that painting. Probably our eye, if we'd gone in this way, we would have paused here at this haystack that's kind of falling over. It's a very kind of clear marker, a thing to look at. And then we get to this moment, and then where do we go? And at a certain point, we might wander these fields for a while, but our eye is probably going to then eventually gravitate towards this line of trees and move back to the far horizon line that way. But what about a painting like this? A painting that isn't a landscape painting and also is more abstract than it is objectively representational. The representations break apart. We don't necessarily even get a whole representation of many things. But if you look at it, and once again, think about the structure, right? The geometric structure, the sense of diagonals going from corner, both from corner to corner, but also corner to center, right? That diagonal is very dominant, and this kind of overall triangular kind of composition there and there, right? And think about how those things also lead to pathways, right? There's sort of like, there are these movements that our eye moves through, and then these interruptions with those movements as we move around. And now, one of the things I want to say is this is a very important part of composition, but it is also not fixed in stone. Any one person might approach a painting and feel like, oh, my eye starts here and I go to there. What helps is if everyone, as they're, let's say as you're writing a paper about this, if you're very specific and if you really think about it over a long period of time, the thing that draws your attention the most, like let's say that moment right there for a lot of people is definitely a strong attention grabber, or this moment right there, isn't necessarily, that's my 1 minute mark. So one of the things I want to say here is your primary focus, the thing that draws your attention right away, is not necessarily the same thing as your entrance point. We're going to talk about that in just a second. All right, I'll continue with that when we get to part